returning to this platform, I've taken a more hands-off approach from community engagement. I've decided to minimize responding directly to comments because, mental health. But at the same time, I don't want my viewers to think that I'm just ignoring them, particularly when they say something that is relevant or constructive to an ongoing discussion. With regards to my last video, I knew that there was likely going to be a bit of disagreement given the subject matter, which is fine. Some of the arguments were rather... What? Wait, why do we have to be sterilized? Vasectomies are quick, minimally invasive, and reversible. And on that note, hi, I'm nobody, but you can call me Peach. Welcome to my channel. And in the interest of discourse, I'm going to address a couple of arguments that were posted by a few commenters from my last video. I'll try to keep it as succinct as I can because I don't want to bore most of my engagement that already agrees with me. So, the first comment is from The Raven. Quote, "Unless you were, it was your choice to get pregnant in the first place. Today, more than ever, we have all kinds of contraception. Condoms, pills, IUDs, vasectomies, you name it. Or, just pulling out. And if an accident does happen, there is the morning after pill. But once a pregnancy has taken place, well, it's no one's fault but yours and your partner's. And let's not forget the issue if the father wants the child. He doesn't get a say, does he? In places with pro-choice laws, mothers have all the say, fathers have none. If the mother doesn't want the child but the father does, well, tough shit. If the mother does want the child but the father doesn't, she can get the government to force him to pay for the child even though he never wanted it." So, there's quite a bit to unpack there. First off, unless someone is deliberately trying to conceive, pregnancy is not a choice. It is a condition that occurs when certain criteria are met. Consenting to sex, whether male or female, is not the same thing as choosing to reproduce, since usually we copulate for reasons other than baby making. This archaic mentality that we have to just accept the unwanted consequences of when we don't have to anymore is just stupid. We don't throw up our hands when the subject is STIs, so why should we do the same with unwanted pregnancies? That's point one. Secondly, I genuinely don't mean to be condescending, but it's incredibly naive to think that the same powers that want to overturn Roe v. Wade to restrict female reproductive rights are the same ones that won't extend that attack to contraception. Their entire point of view is that life begins at conception. For the record, it doesn't. Life began 4 billion years ago and has since been an endless cycle of birth, death, and reproduction. What the anti-choice crowd actually means to say is that personhood begins at conception, which again, it doesn't. A blastocyst is no more a person than the ovum and spermatozoa, which were both alive, as were the organisms they derive from, that fuse together to metamorphose into the thing that it becomes. Just because something has the potentiality to become a person doesn't make it so. We categorize organisms by their current phase of development, not by what they may develop into. But back to the point at hand. Because they believe without evidence that life or personhood begins at conception, they have already made arguments that certain types of contraception are abortifacients because they do not prevent fertilization. Now, science states that a pregnancy actually begins when a blastocyst implants in the uterus. That's when the pregnancy hormone, human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, starts being excreted into the bloodstream and, consequently, in urine, which is what pregnancy tests are constructed to detect. If there is no implantation, then the blastocyst simply passes out of the reproductive tract along with the uterine lining as a normal, if not slightly heavy, menstrual period. That's science. Ignorant people in power, however, think that as soon as Mr. Sperm meets Miss Egg, that immediately equals baby. And pills and IUDs don't prevent that from happening. They prevent implantation. What makes you think that they won't go after those forms of contraception next when they've been making these arguments for decades? It's already been explained to these people that in vitro fertilization will be complicated, if not made all but impossible, if terminating a pregnancy is redefined as terminating a blastocyst prior to implantation. They don't care. They're not in it for facts and data. Point 3. entertaining the idea that they will actually respect a claim as a legitimate exception is also extremely naive. There's a reason why a lot of victims of assault stay quiet in these sorts of communities. They often get blamed. And how long exactly does it take to prove that a rape has taken place? We're talking about a crime, and we all know that the wheels of justice can turn very slowly, whereas trimesters move pretty quickly, which is exactly what they bank on. And let's not kid ourselves into believing that such claims will always be believed in the first place. Remember this asshole and his magical uterus theory about a legitimate will shut that whole thing down? You think people like him exist in a vacuum? Point 4. Pulling out is one of the least effective methods of birth control. Way to increase the need for terminating. And for the 5th and final point pertaining to the Raven's comment, he immediately pivots to the rights of fathers, arguing that it's unfair that fathers have no say in the matter once a pregnancy has begun, which is ironic because now he seems to care about reproductive rights. Males are not the ones who endure pregnancy. In this context, it's important to differentiate between a pregnancy from an infant. As I stated in my last video, pregnancy is very rough on the body, and since it only occurs in biological females, then the decision to carry on with it should be theirs. So if you're arguing that a male should be able to have agency over a female simply because she is pregnant with an offspring that he has sired, well, congratulations. Apparently SCOTUS now agrees with you. I just don't see how this improves anyone's lives, including cis men, since, as you stated, they're the ones who are legally on the hook to provide for the resulting children, whether they want them or not. Once the pregnancy is over and the fetus is no longer a fetus, in other words, they've been born and have taken a breath, they are now undoubtedly people with rights, and one of those rights is the right to be provided for. Once they're in the world, it's no longer about what either of the parents want. So if you think that arrangement is unfair now, how much worse do you think it's going to be after Roe v. Wade is overturned? Your tone implies that you're more interested in punishing American females for their current rights and opportunities rather than any concern for the rights and protections for men. The decision goes back to the state. If you don't like the laws the state has, you can either move or overturn the law. It's a decision that goes from the power of the federal government to the state government. It's the intentional killing of a child. It has gone from safe, legal, and rare to I cannot be expected to be responsible for decisions I made. It's not a contraceptive. It really is very disturbing to see people being so blasé about human rights being a states' rights issue. I've never been okay with that. You're good with losing your bodily autonomy depending on which portion of the country in which you happen to be located? Yeah, no. American history should have hammered it home by now that that doesn't work long term. And as I stated in my last video, the ability to just pick up and move is reserved for people with money or with very few outstanding responsibilities, like not already having a family. So telling people to just move is rather dismissive and unsympathetic to the low-income populations. They need these services available everywhere, because if they can't afford to move, then they damn sure can't afford a child or another child. And no, terminating a pregnancy is not the intentional killing of a child. An embryo is not a child. It's an embryo. When it ceases to be an embryo, it becomes a fetus. And when that fetus becomes viable, which is typically around the 24th week, depending on which facilities are capable of sustaining extremely preterm newborns, then there's an argument to be made. But even then, it's still not counted as a person in its own right. For example, I was pregnant during the last census count in 2020, and the instructions on the census specifically stated that unborn children could not be listed. For purposes of enumeration, they don't have legal names or ages or even sexes, since some pregnant people opt out of being told what the sex of their fetus is prior to birth. Before they were born, my children were not entitled to any benefits like identification, Social Security, the child tax credit on income taxes, bank accounts, health insurance. You need a birth date for all those things. What about citizenship? The U.S. has birthright citizenship laws, meaning that whoever is born here is automatically a citizen unless their parents are foreign diplomats. But if personhood begins at conception, then does that mean that citizenship starts at conception and birth is no longer required for citizenship? And if that's so, then what if the host mother isn't a citizen and is subject to deportation? Wouldn't that mean that the U.S. could not deport her because that would inevitably result in the deportation of the U.S. citizen, aka her fetus? You see why this all falls apart when you try to tack on personhood to someone who legally doesn't exist? And yes, terminating is not a form of contraception. It's a medical procedure that should not be interfered with or hindered by the government. Once again, pregnancy sucks ass. Feeding into this fantasy that people choose to endure this horrid condition day after day after day for months at a time, only to then say, hey, you know what, F it, I changed my mind. It's a lie. Most terminations occur prior to the 12th week, which is when the first trimester, or first 3 months, ends. Terminations that occur past that point are rare because they are already illegal unless medically necessary. And just consider how awful that is for a pregnant person who bears it happily all that time, only to find out that something has gone catastrophically wrong. As much as I hated being pregnant, I lived in constant fear of that the entire time, especially because my first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. Those terminations are not done for elective reasons. They are unavoidable tragedies. Have some compassion. Oh, and as far as the quips regarding vaccination mandates go, as far as I know, nobody was forced to get a COVID-19 vaccine. The mandates barred unvaccinated people from entering certain spaces so they would not be able to keep spreading their pestilence that was killing people. You know, actual people. But if you chose to be an idiot and reject science, you were allowed. You're still allowed. You just couldn't go into certain places because of your stupid choice. But if that's unconscionable to you, then how in the world can you be okay with the government forcing people to gestate against their will? As people smarter than I have correctly pointed out, a government that has the power to force citizens to remain pregnant against their will also has the power to terminate pregnancies against their will. But who cares what I think? I'm nobody. And hopefully this is the last time I annoy people with this subject, at least for a while. Thank you for sticking with me to the end of this video, and as always, all of my references and social media links are in the description, so feel free to ignore doing the clicky thing to stay current with my shenanigans. I'm Peach. Yeah, just a little.